Welcome back, everyone, to the Jake Broe Show. Today on the podcast, we are joined by Jason J. Smart. He is a special correspondent with the Kyiv Post, and I've done several interviews for you, Jason, so I thought it only appropriate to have you here on the channel. And I first want to start by congratulating you on your YouTube success. You've been posting regular content to your YouTube channel. How many subscribers are you at now?
We have about 155,000, I think. So that's been over the course of the past 2 months and change. But it's great to see you, Jake.
So your background, I don't know much about it. I've done interviews for you, but I've never really interviewed you. And on your channel, one of your recent videos, you said you've been working against Russia for the last 20 years. So I just want to get a little bit more of your backstory, your bio. What have you been doing to fight Putin's regime for the last 20 years? And what did you do specifically to get banned from Russia? This was about 15 years ago.
So, yeah, as a background to that is that in high school I took Russian, but then in college I took Russian, and my graduate degrees, my master's, my PhD relate to the foreign policy of the Putin regime, and specifically how the Putin regime operates. But about 15 years ago, I was working for an organization financed by the US government, chaired by John McCain, that specifically worked to create democratic change in Russia. So we work with different people like Boris Nemtsov, Garry Kasparov, and in that period of time, the Russian government decided to list me as a threat to national security of Russia back in 2009. And in 2010, I was informed that I would be banned from Russia for life. And as a result of that, I was also banned from Belarus for life. And it was later in 2010 that I was also thrown out of Uzbekistan. But neither here nor there, we work with democratic movements in those countries. And I'm still very active with Garry Kasparov's organization and continue to advise them. But as a whole, Putin has been a very obvious threat to global security for many years. It didn't just start in 2022 or 2014. It's been going on for a long time. But finally, the world appreciates that, what a threat he truly is globally, and through the rise of asymmetrical warfare, which we see not just here in Ukraine, where I am, but also what we see in Africa, what we see in Latin America, what we see going on in Asia, and how Russia is operating globally in tandem with serious threats, including not just Iran and North Korea, but also non-state actors. Their cooperation with things like terrorist organizations, or the terrorist organizations that then work with the drug cartels. All of this is tied together with the end-all objective of destabilizing the West.
I don't think I've told you this story about how I first learned about you or saw your posts on social media, but I was watching a clip of Russian Media Monitor, and I can't remember if this was late 2022 or somewhere in 2023, but you had posted this story about Solovyov's sons. The fact that Solovyov has two sons of military age, one living in London, and you thought it was strange that Solovyov would be so in favor of this war, but unwilling to encourage his own sons to enlist in the Russian military to go and fight in Ukraine. So this Russian Media Monitor clip with Solovyov yelling and screaming about your post, and then, because whenever they say English names, they always switch to like perfect English, and he's yelling in Russian, then he says Jason J. Smart, and then he's yelling in Russian again. So I was like, who is this guy? So that's when I first found you on Twitter, and I started following you. This was years ago. But let's go ahead and get your thoughts on, how do you think Russian state media is holding up? This was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation, and here we are 3.5 years later. In Kremlin state TV, it's honestly, to me, been very boring lately. They haven't really been saying or doing anything I think deserves like bringing attention to. They don't really know what's going on with Trump and the dynamics there. But I just want to get your thoughts. How is Kremlin state TV handling this war in the year 2025?
So we understand that Russian state TV has got a couple different purposes. And the number one is obviously to be propaganda. And people like Solovyov, for instance, I think is a great example. Solovyov himself was a professor in the United States even of economics. I think he was the University of Alabama, if I recall correctly. These people aren't dumb. They're actually quite bright, but they realize they have a role to play. It's just a job. And so what they say usually lacks some sort of sincerity. You can sort of feel it. They just say things that they think is necessary to control the population better. But everybody has a role to play in that game. For instance, Dmitry Medvedev. People often cite his tweets or his Telegram post. It's highly improbable that he actually writes those. Most likely they're being written by somebody else. But more specifically, why does he say what he says? It's because he's playing a role of being the more extreme of who could lead Russia potentially. And that's very common for dictators around the world. The same with Saddam Hussein. You say it could be worse if I'm taken from power because look if this other guy, look if Dmitry Medvedev took power. That guy's always talking about nuclear war, World War III. And so the way that you distract from the fact that you yourself are a threat to global security is to make him look like even more of a threat. So all these sorts of guys, I agree with you. The Russia TV has been a lot less interesting, but they have a lot less to say. I mean, how many years in a row can they repeat exactly the same things, exactly the same myths, exactly the same lies? It's gotten sort of stale at this point. And it's also become much more difficult to justify how it is that there's drones almost on a daily basis closing down airports throughout Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg as well. And when you look at that, you look at the impotence of the Russian government to be able to stop it. So at this point, I think that they realize they're in a very difficult situation.
You're currently in the capital city of Kyiv, correct?
I am.
Can I ask you, how is the city doing with these near nightly attacks? Putin has publicly, I think, stated the goal is to have 500 or 1,000 drones attacking Ukrainian cities every single night. Ukraine is doing their best with their air defense systems. We're trying to make things better. But in general, how is the city of Kyiv doing?
So it varies. I mean, the objective of Russia at this point, according to President Zelensky, is 2,000 drones by the end of this summer at a time. Now, that would obviously be very difficult for Ukraine to combat. Here in the city itself, I mean, I think that most people are just tired, quite physically tired, because it is such an often occasion that you're woken up all night or multiple times during the night due to not only the air raid alarms, but the explosions. It's very hard to sleep through explosions for long periods of time or routinely, especially when you can hear them getting closer. So that is one aspect of it. Now, we can see the downturn of the economy. We see a lot more places that say for rent on the front doors. A lot of restaurants, cafes, stores have gone out of business. But also now Russia is trying to do more to hurt the economy of Ukraine. Just 3 days ago, a person another time tried to blow up yet another cafe in Kiev. They've been given money by the FSB and explosives specifically to blow up cafes. Now, what's the purpose of that? What's psychological nature? So that people then fear to go out, fear to just live a normal life, and they create a tension in society. And that's something that Russia is aiming for now, which will be a new era of this war when you get down to car bombs and things like this. That is a shift. But I think it's a very difficult situation. However, the population obviously does not want to give up. I've not heard anyone yet say I had a bad night's sleep due to the drones, and so we should surrender to Russia. I don't think that's on anybody's radar. So I think it's difficult, but it could be worse.
The goal of the government is obviously to give people hope to continue. So I see these reports promising new technology. We're getting more Patriots. We're getting an eighth Iris-T from Germany, Hawk air defense systems. They're experimenting with lasers to shoot down these drones. But I think the most promising one is these cheaper interceptors. President Zelensky recently visited this factory that is producing the interceptor drones, the per unit cost being about $1,000. If Russia is launching Shaheeds that cost more than 30,000, and Ukraine can knock them out of the skies with an interceptor for about 1,000, I'm making the assumption that Russia will just stop because they're just burning money at that point if Ukraine can prove this technology is reliable and effective. Is this the light at the end of the tunnel for the civilian population? Like, are these interceptor drones the counter, the answer to make Russia stop these nightly attacks? I understand ballistic missiles and cruise missiles are different. Those are a lot harder to intercept and shoot down. But as far as these cheaper mass-produced Shaheeds, is there potential within the next couple months to making this stop?
Well, they're definitely making a lot of advancements. I mean, it has improved a lot. Just in the past month, we see that more and more Ukraine is using these sorts of interceptors. So that's definitely the way that things are going. Now, I think Russia's objective, though, is simply to outbuild what the Ukrainians can. It's simply to have such a large mass and quantity, and so regularly be attacking cities in Ukraine. Keep in mind, one Patriot missile cost what about $3 million versus the Shahed drones. It's a huge difference in cost, and so there's an entire economics of how the decisions of war are being made, increasingly being made. But Ukraine is playing the same game, and I think that's where a lot of people miss it. I think a lot of it's overreported in the West how often Ukraine is attacked, which I'm glad it's reported, but it's overreported and underreported how often Russia is attacked. It's simply because there's a lot more journalists living in Kiev than there are in Moscow. Who would be reporting from Moscow? So if you actually just saw how routinely Ukraine is striking within Russia, look at the airports of Moscow routinely closed, St. Petersburg, it's just incredible. And just you look in the past few weeks, you've seen that the Russian population is becoming increasingly concerned. They're increasingly worried. is they don't know when it's going to stop. Is it possible that Ukraine just keeps the airports closed for days? Keep in mind, Ukraine just struck in Sochi, Russia. It was within a couple kilometers of Vladimir Putin's residency. The next day, he flew to Arkhangelsk. Arkhangelsk is probably 2,800 kilometers to the north of Sochi. He considered that to be a close call. That concerned him. So we have to consider there is a lot going on right now within Russia, which is far worse, I think, than what the Russians are able to do to the Ukrainian civilian population at the moment.
I've explained this to my audience that we get reports of what happens in Russia, but we don't get good pictures and videos. The reason why is if you're a Russian civilian taking pictures and videos of any damage anywhere and posting it on social media, then the FSB is going to come visit you. So the people of Russia can't share these images and pictures of potentially Ukrainian attacks, which is why I, on my channel, can't talk more about them. But yes, they're also happening. Russian airports are being shut down. Since we're talking about drone attacks, I've been hearing reports that Putin has been getting increasingly paranoid. The cancellation recently of Navy Day. Can you talk about Putin's concerns in general? If Ukraine is becoming more efficient and effective with their own drone strikes on Russia, does Putin genuinely have concerns for his own safety?
Well, Putin most certainly has concerns for his own safety. And in fact, there's been defectors from the security service called the FSO, it's like the Secret Service, that's in charge of protecting Putin. And the last couple of defectors that came out have said a couple of things that are really, really interesting. One is that Vladimir Putin, the one guy said, he'd known Putin for more than 10 years, he'd seen a cell phone in his hand or a computer. The guy doesn't have touch with technology at all because he's scared of it. He's not sure what they could do through it. But that also leads him open then to essentially rumors and people just telling him things. Now, his security service has a goal or I'd say a gain if they're able to convince him that his life is at risk. So they tell him information all the time that makes him believe more and more that he's at risk. And that's why we see throughout Russia, he has multiple offices that are exactly the same and only has artificial light, not natural light, so that he can film things any time of day. If he's in the far east or if he's in the far north or he's in Moscow or in Sochi, nobody will know where he really is. We know that even when he went to Astana, Kazakhstan, which is considered to be a friendly country, in the basement of the embassy, they built an entire full-out bunker with its own telecommunications in case bombing began against the embassy. Not just an attack, but bombing. We see that he's doing a lot of things to try to protect himself. But the recent attack by Ukraine within Sochi is something that obviously concerned him. A year ago, though, on the year before this most recent Russian Navy Day in St. Petersburg, the Ukrainians, according to the New York Times, had intended to assassinate Putin using drones in St. Petersburg. When he would walk out into the reviewing stand, they would take him out. Now, unfortunately, the Russians contacted the Americans, and that actually is the first phone call in over a year between the Department of Defense and the Ministry of Defense of Russia. And they said, listen, we know that the Ukrainians are planning this, make them stop it. And back then, Lloyd Austin, who was the Secretary of Defense, contacted the Ukrainians and said, don't do this. We know what you're up to. It would be bad if you kill Putin. The Americans were worried about escalation and these other things. Now, the irony of that is the Russians have routinely tried to kill Zelensky, routinely. And there's not been a problem about that. But I think this shows a sort of double standard. And the reality is that if Putin were to die tomorrow, it'd be the best thing that could possibly happen for not only Ukraine, but also for the Russian people. Because Vladimir Putin is somebody who has a personal drive to continue this war. As a whole, in Russian society, we don't really see that. We don't see that certainly at senior levels. And there's a very simple reason. Because everyone has their own economic interest. Everybody has their own reason that post-Putin, they'd be fighting to divvy up the cake rather than to fight for some ideological cause. So if Ukraine were to go all the way and just decide to make a Putin-less world, it would definitely change the outcome of this war.
I've explained this to my audience several times that the reason why Russia has not used a nuclear weapon is because nobody in Western intelligence is trying to assassinate him. If he were to use a nuclear weapon, if he's just a rogue dictator with 6,000 nukes willing to use them for any reason he wants at any time, then he's dead. Every Western intelligence agency would then try to be assassinating him. So the story you tell, I don't know how you would verify all those conversations took place. I believe you. I believe the United States has been shielding Putin from assassination attempts because they believe he's a rational actor who will not use nukes. And if he were to die and be replaced, whoever replaces him might be willing to use nukes. Someone crazier, maybe like a Dmitry Utkin or Prigozhin before they were taken out. So yeah, that's not ideal, because I agree with you. I think this war only ends when Putin dies. And if Putin were to die, I don't think Russia would remain a stable and unified state. I think there would be power struggles. I think all of these rival factions that hate each other, that only tolerate and cooperate out of fear of Putin, once he is removed, they're going to be fighting amongst themselves for, like you said, pieces of the pie, I guess. So let's talk about the shrinking pie in Russia and their economic woes. This was pretty shocking to me that the Russian central bank lowered interest rates to 20 to 18. That was called a big drop, I think, in the headlines, when really 18% central interest rates are insane. Now, my limited understanding of central banks is they have two objectives: full employment and price stability. You want the unemployment rate low so everyone has a job and they're happy. That's not an issue in Russia. They have a labor shortage. The other one, price stability, is you want inflation to be reasonable, ideally between 0 and 2%, or at least that's the goal here in the United States. But as far as I can tell, inflation is still terrible in Russia, and they have a labor shortage. So, what possible reason would the Central Bank of Russia be lowering rates? And I know the answer. It's because all of their industries are failing, and with the cost to borrow debt being so high, nobody's borrowing, businesses are going under. So, can I just get your thoughts and reactions to what the central bank has been saying and doing? And some of these public statements made, for example, by Russia's finance minister about genuinely how terrible the Russian economy is doing this summer.
Oh, Russia's economy seriously got problems. And those problems are in a lot of different areas, including the banking sector, which just recently a Kremlin think tank said it could face, quote, systemic collapses within the banking sector. And it's due to liquidity, as you observed. Now, what's really interesting about that is exactly the same question I had. Why would they lower the interest rate then? Now, keep in mind, Professor Hankey, who, for instance, at Johns Hopkins University, has estimated the real inflation in Russia is probably closer to 27%. So why would they be lowering the interest rates? And then the reason is they just need the liquidity. They need cash somehow. But they also have to give the appearance that might be okay. But we know they're not okay. We know that of the 79 largest companies in Russia, 8 of them currently are just in the pre-default phase. They're about to go bankrupt. And look what's coming ahead. If the US puts the sanctions on the companies or countries who buy Russian oil and gas, that's namely India and China, they're about 70% of all the oil and gas that is bought from Russia. Well, that's 40% of the Russian national budget. What do you do if you lose 40% of your national budget? And so why is all this going on and Putin is not reacting to it, not doing anything? I had a really fascinating meeting just recently with somebody who's a very senior intelligence figure, and we were discussing this. And I said, why would Putin make these very irrational decisions that are ultimately bad for his economy? And he observed, listen, this year due to the budget shortfalls in Russia, it's estimated they'll have to devalue the ruble. It's currently about 80 to the dollar, but they think it's going to get down to about 100 to 120 to the dollar. So let's say a 25 to 50% decrease in value. Keep in mind, the average Russian, 76% of their income goes to just food, housing, and utilities. So if that's 76% of your money, what do you do if you lose another 20%, 25%, or 50%? So why does Putin do this? It's because he goes to these meetings, he thinks he's a king, a czar, and he just says, well, just make it work. Just make it happen. And that works. You can order people like that, but they can't work miracles because he told them to. And so the economy is getting much, much worse. And we see all the indications of that. We see it within the banks. We see it within the construction industry. We see it in the real estate industries. We see it in the stock market. In fact, the stock market in Moscow, after they lowered the interest rate, what was the result? The stock market just fell apart. It got much worse because everybody understands what this all means. Consumer confidence in Russia is totally in the drain, and it's getting worse. But how do you think this plays out?
Well, I'm trying, because I understand loosely how the U.S. economic system works, and I'm trying to apply this to Russia when obviously it's different. The Federal Reserve here in the United States is supposed to be independent. In Russia, obviously, it's not. Putin tells the central bank what to do, and like you said, he gives vague orders and then just says make it happen. And he has very capable technocrats who have done a phenomenal job managing all the sanctions, managing the economic strain the last 3.5 years. But I want to ask you, if Russia has a bailout scenario for their large industries, for their commercial banks, they're just printing money, right? Like, the the Central Reserve will buy Russian debts, have it on their books, but they're basically generating money out of nothing. That's how it works with a central bank here in the United States. This Federal Reserve will buy U.S. Treasury debt, basically increasing the money supply. That money came from nowhere, and they're just buying U.S. debt to lower the rates that the government has to pay. That's how I understand how money is generated here in the United States when they say the Fed is printing money. Is that also what Russia does? Like the central bank of Russia just out of nothing buys Russian debt in order to have the Kremlin then issue money to bail out these commercial banks or the railroad industry or the coal industry or the steel industry. These headlines from the Moscow Times, because I check their site every day, it's just because things get progressively worse, we're constantly getting a new superlative, like the biggest drop, the lowest quarter, everything year over year looks worse when we get all this quarter financial data because things are getting worse, and this is the new extreme low for this industry. But is this how I'm genuinely asking you? Is this how this works in Russia? Like the central bank will buy Russian treasury debt, and then the Kremlin will just bail out these industries?
Well, it gets worse, actually. That's a great part. So, in the case, so I did analysis of the banking system in Russia currently and what's going on with all the toxic debt. And it's very similar to the US in 2008, but it's worse because the US, people still want dollars. The US can still get loans from other places. There's options that Americans have, or the American government would have. Russia does not have the same options. So, yes, it would just print money. Now, where that gets really complicated is that at present, Russia is planning to transition to something they call the e-ruble in the next year. The e-ruble is just electronic money. But what makes it funny is nobody wants it. Everybody understands that if the government's just giving you electronic money, it's not really money. And so they want the actual paper. And the government now is forcing everything, especially payments to people, to be done with this electronic rubles. And you ask, well, why can't they just do normal payments? So check this out. One of the reasons that banks are going bust in Russia, outside from just the bad loans, just in the last month, 12% of people that had credit cards were in the 30 had passed over 90 days that they had not paid the bill, and every month that's ticking up by another 3 or 4 points. But when you get to corporations, it's similar numbers. The number of people that are just not repaying debts is huge. But the Russian banks themselves cannot sustain it. And the reason is because the Russian government forces them to give loans to non credit worthy organizations, specifically to people that are in the military industrial complex. So they'll force them to go give out loans to go build tanks. But those tanks then get destroyed. And it's not like you can even use the scrap metal that's back in Ukraine. But it's not like a normal business investment where you're going to generate money. And because you generated money, you have no problem repaying the bank. That doesn't happen. Everything they produce is destroyed. So they're just burning money. And then the loan doesn't get repaid. And that's why they're making their banks, the Russian government is making their own banks more and more unstable. So as this progresses, it seems that the Russian government would have to step in. Now, given the high inflation rate that they already face, and the even worse inflation rate they would face afterwards if they were to step in, it would be a total disaster. I mean, Russia is really facing a dramatically bad situation economically. And there's not a single economist who looks at this objectively that doesn't say this is a total disaster. Russia, quite literally, has no way out of this. They're totally dependent now on oil and gas. And if this continues, and there are the new sanctions, the Russian economy will tank. And that very literally, quite seriously, could end the war very quickly.
So let's talk about how we can make the situation worse for Russia. And Trump, this was half a month ago, said within 50 days, September 1st, he was going to apply sanctions or secondary sanctions or tariffs or secondary tariffs. I don't know. But he's going to do something dramatic to make the economic situation for Russia worse. Trump then recently said, why wait 50 days? I'm frustrated with Putin now. Putin is just jerking me around. So Trump, I think, might have shortened that deadline by a little bit. I just want to get your thoughts and reactions. Do you think Trump will actually take adverse economic actions against Russia? And do you think it'll make a difference? Do you think it'll be meaningful?
Well, the signals definitely from the governments, India and China, have been positive. The minister in charge of oil for India has already said they'll move off of Russian oil. In the case of China, they've also signaled that they would not stick with Russian oil. And it's a very logical reason. I mean, in the case of China, more than 10% of all their trade is with the United States. Russia is less than 2% of their trade. In the case of India, it's the same proportion. It's more than 10% is with the United States, less than 1%, I want to say, is with Russia. So oil doesn't justify losing the rest of their economy. But will Trump do it? I think that's yes, he will. And the reason is simple, though. I think it's he's probably disinterested in this issue himself, but he's currently got political scandals that he's trying to face, and he doesn't have good solutions for them. So historically, when Donald Trump does something really difficult to understand, there's usually something he's trying to hide, and so he distracts the media by doing something. So I think if he were to enact these sorts of sanctions now, it'd be simply to keep the eyes off of what he doesn't want people to be paying attention to. But what do you think?
I think Trump is genuinely annoyed. I think there was a component of MAGA that believed, let's just cut off all military aid and support to Ukraine, ignore Ukraine, and then Russia will just win within 6 months. If we, the mighty United States, are no longer helping our proxy state fight this war, then the proxy war will end. Like, MAGA had such a low opinion of Ukraine that they said, without us, they're doomed. They're doomed within 6 months. And it's been 6 months, and the Russians haven't even taken full control of Chasiv Yar. They haven't taken control of Pokrovsk. Yes, Russia is making progress when they gobble up another mailbox or wheat field and they pound their chest and they say it's a mighty victory. But it's inconsequential when you zoom out and look at the size of Ukraine. I'm going to repeat this in every podcast, every video I make, because everyone needs to hear this. Russia controls less of Ukraine today than they did 3 years ago. When you factor in the territory that Ukraine retook in the, say, the September Kharkiv counteroffensive 2022, and then the Kherson counteroffensive in November of 2022, Russia in 3 years has not made up for all the losses they took to Ukraine's military in 2022. So I think MAGA is starting to realize that this issue is not going to go away. It's not going to resolve itself if the United States just walks away. The war will just grind on, and the Russian ground forces will continue embarrassing themselves. So Trump doesn't want to think about this. He doesn't want to talk about this. He doesn't want media asking him. Every time he meets with a world leader, he wants to be making deals. He wants to be talking about trade. He wants to make money for himself. He doesn't want to be talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine. So I think Trump, out of frustration and annoyance, has gotten to the point where he said, all right, well, what if we, instead of putting pressure on Ukraine to surrender, we put pressure on Russia economically to force them to stop. This has nothing to do with shared values. Trump doesn't care about democracy. He doesn't care about human rights. He doesn't care that Russia is the aggressor and that innocent people are dying in Ukraine. He just wants the issue to go away. He's annoyed. That's my thoughts. What's your opinion of what I think's going on?
It makes perfect sense. I agree with you. I mean, he does seem to be annoyed. I think that is sincere. I think he really did think he would wrap this up, as he said, within a day. I mean, probably a few days, but he really did think that he had that sort of influence over Putin. And what's sort of interesting is how the Russian media reacts to him. And it's an indication of how the Russian government's reacting to him, which is that they viewed Trump. Initially, they treated him sort of like a child or sort of being dumb. But increasingly, they're not quite sure what he's going to do. And they're actually a little bit more careful with their words about him. And I think it's because they really worry. Well, how about if he decides to go all out? How about if he decides to really just, lay the weights on us with the new sanctions and or give weapons to Ukraine or allow different things that they had not anticipated? So they realize that Donald Trump is unpredictable. And that is as something that is made the Russians uncomfortable. They do prefer to have somebody who's predictable. But once again, I think that Vladimir Putin himself, due to his own ego, due to the fact that he lives in his own little bubble, does believe that he is able to control world events, that he's not scared of Trump. He doesn't realize that he's playing with something that is actually dangerous. Those around Putin clearly understand this is a risk because we see the reaction on Russian TV. But Putin's not aware of that. Putin's only aware of his own little bubble where he truly believes that Russia's already at war with NATO, is already at war with the West, and it believes it's engaged in a global war, which is the other part, which is that Russia does believe that this is a world war already. Ukraine is a battle, it's a front, but it's not the war. It's a very important battle or front, but it is not the war itself. I mean, in the last few years, we've seen the governments in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, overthrown by pro-Russian militants. We've seen the Wagner Group and others in Nicaragua. We've seen them in Venezuela. We've seen this shift of huge amounts of illegal immigrants, namely from Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela before the U.S. elections. We see it coming from Syria, which is being bombed as they're sending immigrants into Europe. This is all part of the global war that Russia's fighting. Their objective is to destabilize Western countries with asymmetrical means, and that's increasing by the day. So whether or not Donald Trump himself is cognizant of this, I'm not sure, but I can say for certain that the Russians believe that they are outsmarting the West. And the only way to put them in their place is ultimately to damage their economy so significantly that they cannot play these games anymore.
On your channel, I saw that you mentioned this new polling coming out of the Levada Center about an increasing number of Russians who are fine with just the war ending. How it doesn't matter. I mean, whatever deal that Putin agrees to, or they're very careful when they respond. They support Putin. They're not going to say they don't support Putin. But basically, however Putin wants to end the war, they would support the war ending on whatever terms that Putin say are okay to end the war on. But can you talk about this polling, and perhaps is there a shift in the mindset? I think it's interesting because I see these Telegram posts of military bloggers, and I can't remember who did this analysis, but basically the interaction on posts for fundraisers and the amount of dollars raised by Russian military bloggers, donate money and we'll get supplies to troops at the front lines. Everything has fallen off the cliff. Ordinary Russians are not helping with fundraisers. They're not engaging in posts. They don't want to think about or talk about the war anymore after 3.5 years. So is this polling, you think, genuine, or is there another angle here?
Well, I think the polling is something you should definitely be careful to fully accept the numbers. That being said, Levada Center is definitely under the control of the Kremlin. And there's no real polling in Russia. I mean, I did polling in Russia many years ago, and back then it was already a problem. But today, I think it's totally impossible. Who would say that they actively oppose the war, for instance, when that's against the law? So you're not going to face 10 years in prison for saying that. That being said, if a government-linked organization comes out with things like this, it means that they're signaling something. They're signaling the public sentiment because they want people in the Kremlin to feel and the population as a whole to say, well, listen, it's okay if we stop at this point. And it's not Putin who's weak. It's not Putin who's made bad decisions. It's simply, this is what the will of the people. We're okay with this sort of wrapping up at this point. And that's a strategy. That's just a strategy trying to manipulate the public to think that what Putin is doing, if he does make a peace deal, is because it's simply what the people of Russia want. But Russia itself, keep in mind, is in a really bad situation. People are very worried. Consumer confidence right now is lower than it was in 2022. It's really a disaster. And, a few months ago, I was in Kursk, Russia, when it's still underneath the occupation of Ukraine. And when I was in Sucha, I was asking people, why are things, how are things going? How is life? And what's interesting to me was that people were quite open. They're quite frank. That was actually very surprising how open they were. And one of the things that was surprising me was how often normal Russians talk to me in the street. I'm quite clearly a foreigner when I speak in Russian, but still, they would quite openly say, listen, Putin led us down this road. There's no reason that had to come to us getting invaded. Had he just stopped this already, it'd already be over. But he chose to go on this route, and now here we are under occupation. And I thought that's really interesting. If that's what a common Russian is willing to say to somebody who's obviously a foreigner, and my accent's quite American, then it would be interesting to know what they say at their dinner tables, what they actually say to each other. And I think that there is rising sentiment within the society that it's time to wrap up this war. It's just not worth it. And Russia can't afford to keep taking the losses that's been losing. I mean, it's been estimated earlier today, I read, over 10% of GDP is spent just on the military. That's not sustainable in the long term. That's a really bad idea. But what's your guess? What do you think?
I don't think Russians, the nationalists, they're going to say we want our empire back. Russia is great. I didn't understand ordinary Russians prior to 3.5 years ago. I was pretty ignorant. I knew Putin was a strong man, but I didn't realize how much control he really had. I read Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, which is basically the rise of the 90s oligarchs and then today's oligarchs. But it's KGB capitalism. The KGB took over the country in 1999 when Putin first being prime minister and then took over for Yeltsin 6 months before the presidential election. And Russia Their entire state has been weaponized for this moment. I think the KGB, the first 2 terms of Putin was all about internal control and gaining control of these industries and getting ready to get their empire back. But the goal was always empire. It was always to get back the territories, at least the territories they wanted. Maybe the Russians aren't enthralled with the idea of taking back the Central Asian republics, but anywhere that was Orthodox and was white, the Baltics, parts of Poland, Moldova, Ukraine, maybe even the Caucasus, they always wanted this territory back. But they were going to do it under capitalism. But it's not real capitalism because these are not the best and the brightest leading all these industries. They're just people who are loyal to Putin. They're Putin's friends. And if you have the money, you can always import the expertise. And this is what's been happening the last 25 years. I didn't realize that. I just assumed the people in charge of these banks and these companies in Russia were actually good businessmen, but their only qualification is loyalty to Putin. They can outsource and import the talent to make the oil industry or the coal industry or the gold mines, all that stuff work. They don't actually have to have competent people at the top. So I had no idea how crooked and just really dark Russia was. And now that they've committed to this war and more than 1 million casualties, what do I think the average Russian thinks? And I think they have a slave mindset. They've been fed propaganda their whole life that victory is in their DNA because of the Napoleonic War and World War II. And I don't know why we're talking about World War II, something that happened 80 years ago. There's barely anyone alive from that generation. And Russia pretends like nothing else happened in the last 80 years. None of the bad stuff, just their victory. And then fast forward and Putin. We went straight from the Soviet flag being raised over Berlin to Putin's getting sworn into office. Nothing else happened in between that, apparently.
It is very funny. I mean, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, I do agree with the assessment that he believes we're actually in World War IV. They believe that World War III is what we had in the Cold War because ultimately, World War II, they had 27 million casualties, or death. They could not afford to ever do that again. The militaries are simply too large. And so that's unrealistic. That's why they try to avoid this sort of confrontation with NATO. They realized they couldn't win a war like that. But what they could do is during the Cold War, they dragged the U.S., they helped encourage the U.S. to be involved around the world. Vietnam is a good example. What was actual Soviet loss versus what did that cost the U.S. as far as international prestige, as domestic discontent that arose from that, the cost of the economy. But then we see what happened in Korea. We see what happened throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba. Look at all these different things. Russia already believed back then it was fighting a global war. And it believes it lost because it lost the Cold War. But Vladimir Putin believes that we're now afresh in that same war. And that's actually an excellent point that you made, and I agree with you totally, is that Putin really is a mafia boss. I think that's where a lot of people get Putin wrong, is they think of him as a global leader. Vladimir Putin consolidated the different criminal gangs within Russia. Keep in mind, he was the head of the FSB, the intelligence service, before he became the prime minister in 1999. He was notoriously connected to the various criminal groups going back in the early 90s when he's worked for Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg. Now, fast forward, the 90s were very violent in Russia. There was people just getting shot all the time. That sort of stopped. You don't see that a lot anymore in Russia. And the reason is because he is the kingpin. Everything has to go through him. So he's the cornerstone on which everything else rests. And that's why the different oligarchical groups don't kill each other now, specifically because he's there. He's the one that organizes it. Now, what's interesting about that is that how they work globally. So we see the alliances with FSB, with things like the Iranian intelligence. We saw the October 7th attacks in Israel. Who comes to Moscow on October 23rd? By the way, October 7th was Putin's birthday. But who came to Moscow on the 23rd? Is the leadership of Hamas. So who's inviting Hamas? Russia is. Why? Because they view that as another front in a global war that they're fighting. This is all something that divides the Western attention. This is something that is, look at the work with the drug cartels. Do you realize how much money from the drug cartels is washed via Russian banks? Huge sums. Look at the relationship between Venezuelan intelligence, Cuban intelligence, Iranians, and Russians, specifically washing money from the drug cartels in places like Peru, Colombia, Ecuador. Look at the tri-state area in South America, which is currently one of the top areas that Hezbollah raises money for globally. And guess what? They work with the Russians there. Because the Russian mafia also works because they've got a lot of cash. Drug cartels, keep in mind, have tons of cash. Sanctioned economies, sanctioned organizations, sanctioned countries don't have access to that. They do have banks that can wash it. So they actually have a lot in common. And this is a global conspiracy, quite literally a criminal conspiracy, by Putin and his gang. And Putin is, as it's been said before, every country has its mafia. But in the case of Russia, the mafia has its own country. And that's truly what it is. It is a global enterprise that they're engaged in. And we see its nefarious roots and how it works together, whether it's taking over the gold mines or it's taking over transportation routes for drug cartels. It is engaged in this around the world because it believes ultimately, though it's much smaller, it will be able to defeat the West because it's able to divide it and use asymmetrical means for which we're not prepared. So it is a very interesting period. But Vladimir Putin himself, yes, he's a pure thug and a criminal. He is not a politician. He is a criminal. And he should be thought of as such. He should be thought of as just a mafia boss, which ultimately is what he really is.
We keep hearing this buzz or this noise, and it seems like it's increased that there might potentially be a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Ukraine has always wanted this. Zelensky famously flew to Turkey. This was almost 2 months ago, saying, Putin, where are you? I'm here to talk. But the Russians have put out statements that, yes, this could potentially happen. And even members of the Trump administration are saying, if Trump flies there himself to Turkey, Putin will show up for a 3-person meeting. I personally don't know why Putin would ever do this. Why would Putin be willing to fly to a NATO country? Turkey's a NATO country. Do you think a potential face-to-face between Zelensky and Putin will ever happen again?
No, I don't
Yeah.
think it's realistic for a lot of reasons. I don't. I mean, I think that there's definitely that desire. Erdogan from Turkey is trying to put pressure on this. He does have a good relationship with Putin as well as with the Ukrainian side. But the reality is, it's just not realistic. No, I cannot imagine that. And then if this point they're not willing to even talk to each other on the phone, I don't see why they'd meet in person. What's more going to be achieved there? And I do agree with what actually Medinsky, who's the lead negotiator for the Russians, said the same thing as Peskov, who's a spokesman for the Kremlin, which is more or less the president arrives to sign the document, not to start from fresh, from nothing. Because at this point, the last time there was peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, uh, it lasted 45 minutes. There was nothing to discuss. Neither side was willing to budge an inch. So why should we expect that he's going to show up? There's nothing to discuss and walk away totally empty-handed. I just don't see it being realistic at this point.
Russia's allies around the world, it's been getting interesting, especially in the last 12 months. Syria collapsed. Russia lost an ally. The United States went ahead and bombed Iran, and Russia offered no support. We're now hearing reports that Serbia is willing to potentially participate in sanctions if path to EU membership is promised, or at least the process begins. But I'm most interested by the actions of Lukashenko and Belarus, because it seems like Belarus, that ship has already sailed. They've already been more or less absorbed by the Russians. Belarusian citizens can now vote and run for office inside of Russia. This was a headline like a couple of weeks ago. But I'm genuinely confused why did Lukashenko let the opposition leader go free? This is Sergei Tikhanovsky. I don't know if I'm saying that name correctly. I know his wife in exile has been leading the opposition, but now he's free. And I've seen these interviews. He speaks English, and he's a very compelling, interesting person. And now he's free to do YouTube videos and blog, podcast appearances or whatever, to advocate for his nation, to not be absorbed fully by the Russians. So, can I just get your thoughts? What is Lukashenko doing, and what's happening with Belarus right now?
So that's a really good question. And by the way, there's a lot of very diverse views about that question. Why would they release Tikhanovsky, and his wife Tikhanovskaya is the one who's been leading this movement for the past few years. And ultimately, the answers vary. So you'll talk to one person who follows Belarus carefully, and they'll say it's because ultimately he doesn't fear them because he realizes they don't have a lot of domestic support. And in fact, if you look up the Google search results to see how often people are looking for their names a few months ago before this happened, it's not very common. There's not a lot of huge demand to know more about them within Belarus. So perhaps not viewed to be a threat. In either case, we definitely know that there was a meeting between Kellogg when he flew into Minsk to meet with Lukashenko. In the course of after more than 5.5 hour discussion, they decided to release these people. So that means that there's something in return. What Lukashenko got, though, we don't know. So there must have been something that outweighed the benefit outweighed the cost, and he realized that, listen, yes, releasing them does have some inherent risk, but I get something from the Americans, which I need much more. But we have to wait. It's not clear what that is. At the same time, Putin is becoming very worried about Lukashenko. Now, Lukashenko is totally a shill of Putin. Let's be clear. Like, Belarus does not have autonomy in a great deal of what it does. At the same time, I think that Putin is trying to do things to spoil the relationship that Lukashenko could have with the West. But, for instance, I think in the very near term, we'll see more and more things where drones, for instance, launched from Belarus will end up somewhere like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, specifically because Putin wants to make sure that Lukashenko has the door closed to him by the Europeans. But it is a interesting situation, also difficult situation to analyze because what it means and what's actually going on behind the closed doors, we can only speculate. What's your guess?
Well, Lukashenko, I didn't know anything about the guy prior to making these YouTube videos and talking about the war in Ukraine. And when I look at the old videos, Lukashenko, he was elected in 1994, and he came in as a reformer. The fall of the Soviet Union, Belarus was this brand new democracy. And I just think this authoritarian trap exists whenever power is concentrated. Whenever anyone becomes the executive of a state, they just cling on to power. And I don't think that was maybe his intention when he first came into office, was to stay there for more than 30 years, but it just kind of happened. And then when Putin came to power in 99, and then all the reforms within Russia and Putin becoming this mafia state, Lukashenko got sucked into it when, once again, maybe that wasn't his intention. Was Lukashenko always corrupt? Yes. But was he mass murderer, I'm going to conquer my neighbors corrupt? No, I don't think so. So I think Lukashenko is looking for a way out of this. Putin he sold this war as a 3-day special military operation. Did Lukashenko ever think that this would turn into a 3.5-year war with more than 1 million casualties? And I don't think so. So is Lukashenko Putin's toad? Yes. Will he do whatever Putin tells him to do? He has to. He's entirely economically dependent on Russia. The Russian military is basically occupying his country. They suppressed all the protests in 2020 to keep him in power. But I also think he is hedging his bets. I think he sees weakness from Putin and from the Russian military, and this thing could collapse at any moment. And if Russia collapses, what happens to Lukashenko and Belarus? So by releasing these opposition leaders, by hosting Kellogg, by trying to have friendly relations with Trump, he could just be hedging his bets in the event something bad happens to Putin. He's looking for a way to survive on his own until tomorrow. I mean, I don't think he has a true retirement plan. I think he's just taking this one day at a time, and he's not the brightest person. Like he's not a master strategist here. He's just trying to survive. But yes, I still think Lukashenko's a terrible person. He has killed people. He's an oppressive dictator. He's not a good person. But if he wants to release some opposition leaders and not allow his own military to be drawn into the conflict, then I guess he's doing the world a favor.
Yeah, I guess we could look at it this way. I mean, ultimately, I think that Lukashenko is in a very complicated situation. I obviously have not been to Belarus anytime recently, but from people that I do talk to from Belarusian opposition, actually just here in Kiev a couple of days ago, by chance, I ran into a Belarusian in a Free Belarus shirt on, and he's working with the regiment of the Ukrainian military that's fighting for Ukraine against Russia that's filled with Belarusian citizens. And he was saying that actually back in Belarus, when you talk to people on the street, they realize that Lukashenko is very weak right now. He's 100% dependent on Putin. Actually, it's just an article I read recently that there's massive shortfalls in the national budget of Belarus, and he's asking Putin to bail them out. So overall, Belarus is not doing great, but it's not allowing its military to get sucked into the war directly, despite Putin's pleas. So that's already a positive. At the same time, Lukashenko knows if Putin falls, then he's in a bad situation. And where it gets really interesting, though, and I've heard this twice recently from people who actually have been to Belarus recently, was that what's interesting is that within the leadership of Minsk, unlike in downtown Moscow, where there's Z's painted everywhere and all this pro-war propaganda, Minsk does not have that. That's not everywhere. And that's not what the public sentiment is. The people don't want to be part of that. Belarusians and Ukrainians are much more similar than either one is to Russians. But aside from that, what's sort of interesting is that they said, listen, he understands very well that from the way things are going, Putin, it's not only that he controls less of Ukraine than he did in 2022, he controls less of Russia than he did in 2022. Because there's been occupations of parts of Russia. And today there's still little parts of Russia still being occupied. So in fact, Putin, he could end up losing this all. And Lukashenko knows that would be the end of him. And what does he really care about is the same as all dictators. Ideology is one thing, but my survival is the most important thing. And he realizes being tied to Putin like this is not going to help him in the long term. So it's going to be interesting to see how he tries to play the next moves to protect his own regime. What do you think is going to happen, though? And what do you think is going to end up happening to Putin?
Uh, well, this war, I think, will only end when Putin is arrested or dead. So the question is, can some Western intelligence agency or the Ukrainians get to him, take him out? Or will something naturally happen? A stroke, a heart attack? I mean, there's a secret countdown clock somewhere to Putin's death. We just don't know what the time is. Or will someone in Putin's inner circle, or will a bodyguard just choke him out or something? I do think that is the most likely way this war is going to end. We're not going to see it coming. We're just going to wake up one this morning and the headline will be Putin is dead.
Mm-hmm.
We might not even get the truth of how he died. Like, it could be a poisoning or something, and then the Kremlin covers it up and they go silence. The Swan Lake appears on television, and then 72 hours, a nice man in a nice suit comes out to the podium and says, "I'm now in charge of the country. Do what I say, otherwise I will kill you." And then that person is going to have to deal with internal consolidation of power. They're going to want recognition from Western governments to have legitimacy. And the only deal that will be offered to them is take your military out of all the occupied territories today, and then we'll start working with you. The primary threat is going to be the nuclear weapons. This person is going to have to maintain the command and control of all of these weapons. So there will be engagement. We will have to talk to this person. We'll have to work with this person. But we're going to tell them we're only going to talk to you and work to you if you take your military out of the occupied territories. It's going to be chaos. For the rest of Trump's presidency, it's just going to be chaos, one day at a time. So I appreciate you being there with me, Jason. This is not how I envision spending my life, talking about the news in literally the worst time to be alive, probably since World War II, as far as global instability. Pax Americana has fallen. The United States is not the police of the world anymore. We're pulling out our diplomats. We're pulling out our military. And we're just saying, people who want to kill each other, just kill each other. Thailand and Cambodia. I didn't see that coming. Why are Thailand and Cambodia fighting? And this is just going to happen everywhere in the world. If there's not an 800-pound gorilla, the United States military, keeping the peace, everyone says they hate the U.S. military and that we're, bullies or whatever. But well, fine. The Trump and MAGA are saying we're going to leave the world and we'll let you figure out your own problems. That's a recipe for disaster. We are in World War IV, if you want to call it. And I just have to do what I can to control my own life and try and find personal satisfaction and happiness in a world that is just going to get worse. It's just going to get things are going to get dark before they get better. I hope they do. I hope that we can invent some kind of technology that will solve our problems and make life more tolerable. But in the short term, I think a lot of people are going to die over the next decade in all of these various skirmishes. And I hope we can just keep nukes out of the equation. Is that dark,
It's looking
Jason?
pretty bleak. No, but I mean, the fact is, it's it's as John McCain used to say, it's usually darkest right before it turns totally black. So I think that the fact is that the situation is quite difficult globally. At the same time, should something like the Putin regime fall, I actually agree totally with your assessment. I think that the person would seek, the post-revolutionary phase is always the most dangerous because people say, who are you to take power after they kill Putin or Putin dies? And so in which case, what do you have to do? Well, you bring the military out of Ukraine because you won't get international recognition without it. And that's a very key part of legitimacy is international recognition. But also, you need the soldiers in Moscow to protect you and your new regime. But you also have to have access to the military weapons, specifically the nuclear weapons, because no one's going to consider you actually to be president of Russia unless you have the nuclear arsenal. That's sort of the key to the palace. So I totally agree with your assessment. But where it goes from there, actually, I think it would be better. And there's no scenario that I can easily imagine where it gets worse after Putin, no matter who takes power, simply because you have to understand what drives these people. It's not an ideology. It's a desire for money. It's a desire for power. And so I think that they ultimately would serve their own interest and consolidate power within their own country and not be into adventurism, because that is what caused the downfall of Putin. Now, does it get worse? It potentially could get worse. But I think that once Russia is taken out of this, because it's such a strategically important ally of the non-state actors that are sanctioned, such as the terrorist organizations or the drug cartels or the mafias, but also of the state actors that are sanctioned. They're all a black market together. That's what sanctions do. They create black markets. And so that's why they're all working together. But if you could get rid of the central player in that, I think globally, the degree that we see terrorism, be it Islamic or other, would decline sharply. I think that the degree that we'd see this interruption in our elections, the manipulation of our populations in Europe, the US, Australia, New Zealand, it would decline because Russia is the one that is investing by far the most to try to create a destabilized West. So actually, on the other hand, I think things could get better. But it all depends if somebody's going to finally end the Putin regime.
I've had that thought as well. If Russia falls, maybe we can get these bot farms in St. Petersburg to stop poisoning us on social media. That would be nice. Um, we'll see if we can get there. Jason, we've come up on an hour. I just want to get your closing thoughts. What message do you have for the audience who's made it this far? These are diehard supporters of Ukraine. They're with Ukraine for as long as it takes. What thoughts or message would you like to give to them to encourage them to continue spending their time supporting Ukraine?
Well, first, I think that anyone that's supporting Ukraine still is obviously not just on the right side of history, but on the winning side. As you know, I am here in Kiev, Ukraine, right now, and the war is very real. It's something we feel, we hear, we see every day, and it's truly a war between good and evil. Because as we were discussing, Vladimir Putin is a threat to global security. And if Ukraine is able to prevail in this and is able to win, which I think realistically can happen, it's not just something that's being said, realistically it can happen. The Putin regime is extremely weak. You should maintain your hope because there is a very serious chance that just suddenly the ruble starts to hyperinflate, or whether Putin doesn't wake up one morning, or is forced into a dacha somewhere outside the city and we don't hear from him again. A lot of things could happen dramatically just tomorrow. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. And keep in mind, it's not a question of whether or not we wish to stick with Ukraine. We have to, because it's ultimately us, all of us who live in the West. It's in our own national interest. If Ukraine were to not win, it would be a disaster for us, not just for Russia and for the Ukrainians, but what that means for all these different autocracies around the world, these criminal organizations around the world. Our quality of life will go down. And so by sticking with Ukraine this far and doing what you can to get others to stick with Ukraine, it's something that will actually not just help Ukraine, but it'll ultimately help your own country, your own neighbors, and your own family. Because Ukraine is something that is going to be fundamental to how the history of this century is written. And it will fundamentally change what plays out next globally.
I absolutely agree. Thank you so much for your time, Jason. I also appreciate all your efforts to support Ukraine and also the West. But until the next time we talk, take care.
Great talking with you.